Métis identity is simple, right?
You think of a Métis, you think of the Red River Jig, Batoche, Fort Garry.
The Métis National Council says yes.
They have it in their heads that they're the only Métis.
But wait, Métis peoples in the Maritimes?
We are more Métis than what the MNC is. Their history came from us.
The fight is on.
There are no Métis communities in Nova Scotia.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran. Tonight on APTN Investigates. At face value, the term Métis seems simple enough. A Western Canadian people born on the banks of the Red River. Their leader, Louis Riel. But increasingly, groups in Atlantic Canada say they're just as Métis. And not only that, the first Métis originated there hundreds of years before Riel. The Métis National Council rejects that belief. It's become a sharp divide over who should be calling themselves Métis. An identity crisis. At stake are potential benefits, the outcome of recent court victories. We start with what conventional wisdom suggests, who the Métis are.
It's who we are. It's natural. It's in our DNA. It's just things we do. Even as a child, it's just like our humor, our gathering, our social identity.
Haney lives in the Métis community of St. Lazare, a stone's throw from the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border.
We thrived. We're a big Métis community before even anybody came here. People got to understand that Métis is more than Aboriginal ancestry with European blood. It's history. It's the grassroots things. It's all that combined. We're going right now to the historical Fort Alice. Very important historical place for the Métis people. A lot of the Métis people around here, their roots are at the Fort Alice. They were born here. All this big open area right there, all this here was the Fort Alice.
Haney wants the nearly 80-year-old monument replaced.
Other depots for Indian trade in pemmican. You know what? Well, you know what? They put what they want. Most of the trading in pemmican was done by the Métis people.
Haney believes there is only one true Métis who come from Western Canada.
But in all reality, though, the majority of the Métis people, they're in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta.
In Atlantic Canada, there are many who would say, no way.
I'm not First Nations. I'm not Inuit. So I'm Métis. I'm of mixed blood.
Growing up in rural New Brunswick meant hiding that fact until recently.
Because for me it was a personal journey to uncover this little secret in the family. My great-grandfather, that's where he had his buckwheat flour mill. And he would have lost all his business from surrounding farmers if they would have found out that he was Aboriginal.
For now, a cramped office serves as the national headquarters. That's because fire destroyed what was to be the head office.
All I remember is getting out of our vehicle and stepping to the back of the vehicle and dropping to my knees and crying and screaming and really distraught. It's a hard loss. You know, we worked so hard to get, for the past 3 years, to get it where we were to almost completion.
A few nights later, this small trailer went up in flames. An accelerant was used over here.
As you can see, down here we have our fire line where somebody had just deliberately tried to set fire to our log cabin.
The fire is still under investigation, and it has nothing to do with the issue at hand. However, Dubé's bad summer started even before this, back in June. She was invited to a conference in Ottawa about the Daniels decision. She got up to ask a question about how groups in the Maritimes had been called Métis centuries ago.
In the late 1500s and early 1600s, and children were registered as Métis.
You wouldn't listen to any of that.
She's referring to Clem Chartier.
Vive la nation Métis!
president of the Matey National Council. The MNC represents 5 provincial organizations from Ontario and from each western province. Chartier told Dubé the Prairie Métis are a distinct people with a distinct homeland.
But you're not part of us, and you'll never be part of us.
Whoa! Oh my! Excuse me.
Stop you there.
I took it as a personal attack, and I also took it as him not being well educated.
The rest of the conference didn't get any better for Dubé.
We had this huge debate. Métis, I'm Métis, I'm not, I'm Métis, but you're not. Like any war, divide and conquer. I think that's the mentality that's going on now.
Who does Clem Chartier think he is?
Gregory Burke is chief of the Brador Lake Métis, a group from Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia.
To say that you are not Métis. That's a dictatorship. And when you allow that to happen, then we have a serious problem in Houston.
Burke reached out to the MNC at one point. He hoped to join the organization.
There was no response. I sent several emails, several letters, made several phone calls, and they should take the infinity sign off their flag because they're contradicting that infinity flag when they've ignored me.
This is kind of, I think, a very important representation of Métis history, Métis culture. It's something like substantial.
Adam Gaudry is a self-described Red River nationalist.
It's important that Métis remain in charge of determining who is Métis.
And believes the term Métis is too widely used, especially when it comes to self-identification.
Like I said, there could have been mixed communities elsewhere, absolutely, but they didn't have the same kind of nationalistic understanding of the Métis Nation, and they didn't call themselves Métis, so why are we calling them Métis?
Dubé rejects the suggestion she's not Métis, and rejects being called a non-status Indian.
And for me, a non-status doesn't exist. It's like a very gray area. Either you're First Nations, you're Métis, or you're Inuit, or you're nothing at all.
Clams, I dug them yesterday, so they're fresh, yeah.
Garnet Purdy and his pals are getting ready for a clam bake.
The word Métis, I guess we've just used that probably for the last 20 years.
It's taking place on an island, part of the Tuscan chain, not far from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And it's not just the sheep that call the place home.
Well, this is where our families have lived on these Tuscan Islands for the last 275 years.
He says they're a mixture of English, Scottish, and First Nation.
We are always comfortable with half-bloods or half-breeds.
But that's not what they call themselves anymore.
We use that strictly now. I don't think you'll find anybody calling themselves a half-breed. They'll just use the word Métis. We're comfortable with it, and like I said, other people understand exactly what we're trying to say, who we are.
If one considers the word Métis as a marketing brand, it's been relatively successful.
A lot of the time, the Matey Nation is the standard in which these groups are trying to meet. And so using our terminology, which is now enshrined in law, they're aspiring to kind of become Métis on the scale that the Matey Nation is, and even though there's not the history for it.
Its leader is one of the most recognizable in Canadian history. Riel and his provisional government led Manitoba into Confederation. Harry Daniels helped secure the Métis as an Indigenous group in the 1982 Constitution.
The first time I've heard the word Métis was back in '82 when my brother called me and said, we're Métis.
Gaudry says the rhetoric has gone beyond the mere act of recognition.
The argument that the Eastern Métis, the Eastern so-called Métis, are the founding part of the Métis Nation, I think is a power play to say that, they're older than us, they're more authentic than us.
This probably started out east. Out west, their history, they can trace it back to 1800s. Our history, we can trace back to the 1600s.
I think they want us to recognize them as superior or more authentic or more legitimate than we are. I think that's really what they want. And I don't think it's either reasonable or realistic that they make those demands.
I can say today that the MNC has stole some of their culture from southern Texas because I see them clogging. and fiddling in country and western music. So maybe they don't have an identity. Maybe they stole all of their identity.
Language on social media surrounding this dispute is even more severe. Red River Métis nationalists compared to the Gestapo. Métis leaders accused of lateral violence and linked to African slave traders.
Sometimes do I get hangry? For sure. I'm a human being.
Sebastian Mallet is the author of those mean tweets.
To travel to Acadia, for example, and tell these people that they have no right to call me Métis. So when I'm calling out that ideology, as I think I'm doing, and then, you know, my words are responding to that harsh context.
Mallet says his stance led to being bullied himself, and he responded in kind on social media.
Now, in the passion of it, of course, sometimes, especially on Twitter, you get exchange that can be a little bit more heated or capture more attention than the other. But I'm trying as much as I can to move toward a more productive and a more positive conversation.
Conversely, Gaudry feels he's got a target on his back for defending the Red River position.
It's tough, it wears on you, but it's an important thing that a lot of us feel we have to do. It can undermine who we are as a people. If everyone is Métis, no one is Métis.
Does it really matter how people identify themselves? The Métis on the prairies would say it's a big deal. Victories in court have given Métis tangible rights, such as the right to hunt. But not everyone who is mixed blood can claim those rights. More on that when we come back. Coming up, I'll talk more about how the courts are deciding who is Métis and who is not. But before that, just where do many of these Métis in the Maritimes come from? We start in a place called the Village Historique Acadian.
In 1604, 79 Frenchmen established a colony in what is today New Brunswick.
Since they didn't knew how winter was hard here in Canada, they suffered greatly there, and half of the men died on that island and were buried there.
Families didn't start arriving until the 1630s and 40s.
Not everywhere, but some of them did marry between the two cultures. We don't have a Métis culture or Métis. That name or that signification is not here like it's out west.
Gregory Burke and his supporters disagree. They say the Acadian Métis began soon after colonization.
They didn't have any wives, and they married the Mi'kmaq wives. What come out of that were the children of mixed breed, the half-breeds.
Burke says that having one Mi'kmaq ancestor from that era is enough to make a person Indigenous today.
I mean, I always identified that I was Indian, and I only have one ancestor. So who has the right to say I'm not Indian?
He takes the time to show me the site of the ancestral communities the Acadian Métis once occupied in Cape Breton.
They came and they settled. We had altogether, I was pretty sure there was 70 families in the middle of the 1700s.
It's for our ancestors that had to suffer the genocide. It's for our ancestors that for hundreds of years they weren't recognized as the Indigenous people. And it's time that we do be recognized as Indigenous people.
His group went so far as to demonstrate in downtown Halifax 2 years ago, asking the province for recognition.
We've been ignored for the last 400 years, and our movement came forward since 1973 and have continually been ignored.
My position is there never was what we could call a Métis settlement in Nova Scotia.
The local newspaper published his letters to the editor.
For the Bredor Métis group, it wasn't positive. They did not like my articles, letters. I grew up in the same community as many of your members. I've known some of them all my life. It came as a shock to me in the last couple of years that they're Métis.
Burke dismisses views like Patrickins.
I don't take that very seriously.
But he once spent a year in human resources and remembers an Aboriginal applicant.
She said, "Oh no, I'm not First Nations, I'm Métis." And I thought for a second, I said, okay, well, like, where are you from? You're from Manitoba, part of the Red River settlement? No, I'm from a community down the road. I came to the conclusion she was claiming she was Métis and joined the group because she had an Aboriginal ancestor from about 300 years ago. She was claiming she was an Aboriginal and should be given some special consideration for employment.
Painted by his descendant, David Garneau.
Adam Gaudry believes that recent court victories, like the Daniels decision, have led to misunderstandings about Aboriginal rights.
I think there's a perception that Daniels opens up Aboriginal rights to a larger number of people. It doesn't do that. It's a jurisdictional case, so people wanting access to resources, whether it's hunting rights or it's a leg up in university admissions processes, or it's access to scholarships. I think a lot of it is driven by the perceived benefits that Indigenous peoples get.
Tanya Dubé notes that when the Daniels ruling came down this past April, current and potential members wanted to know one thing: if they could start filling up tax-free at First Nation-owned gas bars.
Because a lot of them called in for gas cards. And I said, well, first of all, what's a gas card? Well, and it's been timely to sit down and explain to our members a lot of stuff. Like, no, that's not right. That's for First Nations.
But as far as Métis rights go, the Pali case is far more important than Daniels.
The Pali decision also kind of transformed how Métis were perceived. And I think it's with Pali that we begin to see the formation of new communities that were attempting to access Pali rights, particularly in Atlantic Canada.
Named after Steve Pali, the Supreme Court of Canada agreed in 2003 he had an Aboriginal right to hunt.
But the court wasn't about to give that right to just anybody who claimed to be of mixed blood status. Instead, it created the Pali test. In order to pass it, a Métis community needed to establish itself before the Crown took control. Should have existed continuously since then, and still exists today.
In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, there have been 9 cases in the past dozen years testing Pali.
All 9 cases were rejected by the courts. 3 of those cases were appealed to the Supreme Court. Their appeals were denied. In other words, the provincial court decisions were upheld. Well, you've had 12 shots at it now, and you don't have one victory from it.
Nice piece. It's a good piece. Oh, yeah.
Dubé admits passing a Pali test will be difficult. 1670 is the date pegged as when Acadia came under colonial control. And proof of a continuous community since then is lacking.
We know that they did exist. It's just that we have a hard time finding the documents. They were well hidden or destroyed.
Sebastian Millette would like the Pali test to take in the historical circumstances, like the Acadian Expulsion in the 1750s, for example.
The Acadian Métis people faced deportation, the systematic destructions of their communities. Those historical communities were, not encouraged to exist by the government for almost 200 years.
The distinction between Acadian and Acadian Métis is sometimes not very clear.
It's very confusing for a lot of people to say, well, if you're Acadian, then you're a Métis. Well, it's fair to say that the Acadian were the Indigenous people. So is it safe to say that all Acadian are Indigenous? Yeah, it is. But are they of the Matey culture? They could be.
It did not target some sort of Métis community that existed there. It had targeted Acadians, right? It's why it's called the Acadian Expulsion. It targeted a settler population that the English felt spoke the wrong language, practiced the wrong culture, and practiced the wrong religion. It was a targeted attack on Acadians, not Métis.
Millette and other supporters of Atlantic Canadian Métis point to the Daniels decision. Yes, it had nothing to do with identity, but paragraph 17 contains a reference to a Métis community in Le Havre, Nova Scotia.
And this is not just a random quote that the Supreme Court would put there. The Supreme Court arguably are doing their homework when they're writing a decision, especially after 17 years of a trial.
Le Havre is about an hour's drive south of Halifax and was briefly the capital of Acadia in 1636. But Patrickin says it would be a stretch to suggest it's still a Métis community.
If it's to the point where they're claiming that the Acadian Métis is essentially the Acadian culture and the Acadian traditions and the Acadian people, and if you're a descendant of that, you have some Métis background, I would estimate there'd probably be at least 100,000 more Nova Scotians who could show that.
The Métis National Council refused a request to comment on this story. A spokesperson would only say that the courts have already determined who the Métis are.
Which is an outside imposed test on the Métis people, mind you. It's sad to me to see that some Métis are now saying, are you a Parler Métis? If you're not a Parler Métis, then you're not a right or a true Parler Métis. This conversation to me is strange at best.
Batage Days this past summer, an APTN Investigates asked about whether or not there are Métis in Atlantic Canada.
I don't believe that just a mixture of blood makes you a Métis person. Here we know exactly who would be a Métis and who wouldn't. There it's a little bit more difficult.
I would say yes.
Well, they're mixed blood people. I don't know if they're Métis.
This is the entrance to our park here.
Haney admits about his unfamiliarity with Métis in Atlantic Canada.
But maybe I'm biased towards that, you know. Maybe I'm ignorant of down east. Maybe down east they got the same ways as us.
You can do some.
That's going to make some nice stuff.
Do some dream catchers. Actually, it's nice for moccasins.
Tanya Dubé and her husband Jean-Guy say the Canadian Métis Council plans to open an affiliate in Manitoba soon.
Right now it's the bad, but the good is going to come.
Oh well, we'll get there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And do a nice landscaping.
She remembers how she felt when she learned she was Métis.
You just felt whole. You felt all together, all one piece, right? And you didn't feel like you were alone anymore, or that something was wrong in the family and some big dark secret that was hanging over your shoulders, right? So that's what it felt like. It felt like relief.
So how does the federal government respond to the question of who is Métis? APTN Investigates asked Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett.
I think that still the poly test is there, but I think that it also means that people who lost their status for other reasons or who are in a different category, we have to figure out what that means.
So how do the Mi'kmaq feel about Métis groups in Atlantic Canada? After the Daniels decision came down this past April, the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative put out a statement. It said in part that Aboriginal and treaty rights and title belong distinctly to the Mi'kmaq, and that they remain the exclusive rights holders in the region. Gregory Burke plans to bring a case to test Powley. However, he had no details on when this is expected to happen. Next week, we'll be taking a bit of a break. Because it's Remembrance Day, you can tune in for a repeat showing of A Soldier Scorned. In 2 weeks, Josh Grummett will have Wheels and Deals, our used car businesses targeting Aboriginal customers who have bad credit, saddling them with high interest loans and debt. I'm Todd Lamarand. Have a great evening.